All right, what's up, everybody? Second. It's so hard to loosen this. Plus, I don't think it's gonna actually stay up. If I remember correctly, it just still sits and drops. There it goes. It's just dipping down, slowly but surely. It just doesn't want to like me tonight. Hey, listen, I'm excited that you're here. I'm excited that you are listening to our James series, whether that is with us for the very first time. Maybe it's later, afterwards, or whatever it might be. But I'm excited that you're here, that you're checking it out, and hope that you learned something kind of as a part of this, and that you God expands your excitement for His Word. Again, I appreciate you being here. We're going to jump right into James 3. Again, we've already covered James 1 and James 2. I don't have the things there, but if you type in either in the, if you're watching on YouTube later, you can go look back at the other videos, or if you are in Twitch, if you type in !YouTube, I will then link you a video for the other videos that we've done for James 1 and 2. And it's been really good. James is a very practical book, and so kind of James being the half brother of Jesus, that his book is often considered like a Proverbs type book for the New Testament. And so it's very practical living. And kind of for James, the big thing is that he wants people to know how to love God and love others. That's kind of his big thing that you'll see throughout the book, is trying to teach them practically, tell, Christians, believers, how do I live this out? What Jesus called the greatest commandment and the second greatest commandment, to love God and to love others. That's how all the commandments are summed up in those things. And so James is trying to help them learn how to do that and giving them some wisdom as a part of that. So a lot of the book is actually talking about wisdom. And a lot of the book is actually talking about specific things and kind of broad things. So that's what we're jumping into, James 3. This is actually going to be a quicker one of the other ones. James 2 is really long because we had to talk a lot about some theology and making sure that we don't walk away confused by what James is saying. And so chapter 3 is pretty straightforward. All right, it's pretty cut and dry. It's pretty clear what he's going to be saying. And so we're going to jump into James 3. Again, if you got your Bibles, feel free to open them up. I go out of the ESV, but you're welcome to use whatever you want to use as a part of it. All right. So, as you can see, we take a lot of notes in our Bible. I encourage you to do the same thing. If anybody's watching right now, can you tell me, is the screen flickering for y'all? I'm just curious. It's flickering on mine. I don't know if it's flickering on yours. As long as it sounds good, that's all I care about. You can deal with a little bit of flickering for me. Totally not a big deal. What's up, y'all? Thank you for the follow. Okay, so we're going to jump right into chapter 3 as a part of James and kind of see where we're going and kind of what he's going to be talking about next. Again, kind of in chapter 2, he started out with this idea of the sin of partiality and that we shouldn't prefer one over another, especially rich versus poor. And having one preference over another. And so then he gets into this idea of faith without works is dead. And as we talked about it last week, it does not mean that that a couple of different things, that your salvation isn't secure. That's not taught anywhere else in the Bible. It's not what James is saying here, that you can lose your salvation. And he's not also saying that that if you don't have works, then your faith, that your salvation isn't real. That's not what he's saying either. As we talked about, that what he's saying is, no. I want you to know that your faith, that this without works is dead. This word dead is inactive, is useless. And so you have faith, you're secure in that faith, but in that salvation, if you're not doing anything with it, then it's ultimately useless. And so that's kind of how we end chapter 2. And then we're going to start up here in chapter 3. And it starts off with a really hard call, especially to someone like me who's a pastor. All right, so it says this. It says, not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness, okay? So he's already starting off the bats with a pretty clear warning, all right? So who is this a warning to? Because this is going to be important as we kind of work through the rest of the chapter to see who he's writing about and who he's kind of talking to. But he kind of starts off with not many of you should become teachers. Okay. So what is a teacher? Well, James is obviously a teacher, right? Because he says, for you know that we who teach, so he's including himself as a part of that. And then he says, will be judged with greater strictness. And again, chapter 3 is really a pretty cut and dry kind of thing. We won't spend a ton of time on it. But he wants to make sure there's a warning for people that desire to teach, people that desire to have authority, people that desire to have leadership. In today's world, it would be in churches and over people that if you are looking to be a spiritual leader, that's great. But the warning is that, as James says here, that if that's you, then you're going to be judged more harshly. And I don't believe that judgment is just about others, but it's also with God. That God is going to hold you responsible for the things that you do and the things that you say, both in front of people and when they're not around, which we'll talk about kind of as we go through this. So he's kind of given this clear thing. Now we're going to see throughout this that he's going to talk as if in this kind of context, right? That he's talking to people who think that they want to be teachers. So he's going to talk about the tongue. He's going to talk about the danger and all that kind of stuff. But there are still some really good truths that we need to know and that we need, that just as general Christians, that these are still going to be important things to us. But he really wants to make sure that teachers hear this, okay? So here's what he goes on. He goes on in verse 2. He says, for we all stumble in many ways, and if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle his whole body. And so he kind of gives this thing, and I almost picture it like a little bit sarcastic, because if anyone does not stumble, right? So he says, if anyone does not stumble in what he says, so in that way, with his tongue, he is a perfect man. Now, James knows that there's only one person who's ever been able to do this perfectly, and that would be Jesus, right? That would be his half-brother. That'd be the guy that he didn't ultimately have faith, that he didn't ultimately believe until after the resurrection. Yolo, give me just a second here. Let me actually tag that. I forgot to create that command before I started, so give me just a second here, and I'm going to get that up for you. So give me 2 seconds here. Because I've got it. I just need to put it in the chat here for you, my friend. And so James is kind of referencing here that Jesus is the only one that's perfect. So don't think of yourselves as able to be perfect. Just understand that this is not who you are going to be, right? That you are not going to be able to do this. And it should be pretty clear that you're not going to be able to do this. Why? Because he says anyone who does not stumble in what he says. And I like to use this example. If I go to someone like, well, you're a sinner. Well, no, not really. Like, I don't really murder anybody. I don't really kill anybody. Okay, but do you ever lie? Well, yeah. Okay, then that means you're a sinner, right? It's a very clear, everybody lies. It's a part of our human nature, right? We're not even taught to do that. Little kids learn to lie because it's a part of who they are. It's part of the sin nature. So James is saying here, if anyone does not stumble what he says, he's a perfect man. That's not you and that's not me. Okay, so this is not going to be us. That this is only going to reference Jesus here. But he's saying here, he's also able to bridle his whole body. That what he's going to be pointing to here, is also able to bridle his whole body. Is that there's going to be some important things he's talking about. And it's going to be this correlation between the tongue and the rest of who we are. The things that we say, the things that come out of our mouth, that it's going to ultimately have huge weight and huge importance because it's going to guide a lot of the things we do. And so he goes on in verse 3 and 4 says this. It says, if we put bits into the mouths of horses so that they obey us, we guide the whole bodies as well. Look at the ships also. Though they are large and are driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. And so James here is giving us two examples here to reference the point that he's making, which is the power of the tongue, right? And what he wants us to understand is that, and anytime I say tongue, I also mean just words, like things that come out of your mouth, right? So he wants his readers to understand that this is powerful and not like, okay, well, I've got strong arms, or I got a strong body, or I got strong legs, or something like that. Your tongue ultimately in the scheme and the scale of your body is very small, but yet like a ship, like a cruise ship, those cruise ships are massive, right? Massive. Thousands of people can fit on a cruise ship, and yet there's a man on the dock who steers it with a steering wheel, of a large one, right? But steers it, and it's done by a small rudder. And just like a horse, this majestic, strong animal, when you put a bit in its mouth, you can lead it this way or that. That just that bit in its mouth, that little bitty thing in the scope of the scale of the horse is small, but yet it completely controls that horse. And so James is saying, listen, you are no different. Your tongue is no different. This is going to be important. This is how powerful your words are. Okay, so it goes on. In verse 5, he says, so also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. And so the first kind of thing that he wants us to see here is that the tongue matters. We're going to see why he's saying that here in just a second. But that's really kind of the first thing, that even small, it matters. And we have to take care of it. Almost as much as anything else, we have to take care of it, okay? So it says, the tongue is small, yet it boasts of great things. And it goes on in verse 5, second part of verse 5 says, how great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. I'm going to do this in red, right? So he just given us two examples of the power of the tongue, right? And then he also gives us another. He goes, how great a forest, right? So this big, massive forest is set ablaze, so completely on fire by such a small fire, right? And we hear about this all the time, right? In the States, whether it's Colorado, whether it's California, you hear about this, that these massive fires that consume thousands of acres and destroy people's homes and businesses and vehicles, and it destroys their lives. It almost always starts out with a small fire. Somewhere there's a small fire that grows and builds and ultimately destroys an incredible amount, but it started out small. And that's the warning that he's getting. That's the picture that he's painting here, is the power of the tongue. He wants them to understand that the things we say have the ability to absolutely destroy our lives. Remember what he was talking about there at the very beginning, right? That not many of you should become teachers, for you know that those who will teach will be judged with greater strictness. That he's making sure that you understand that as a teacher, that if you are someone who desires that leadership, that you are going to be judged even stricter than other people, because God's going to hold you responsible for those who he has put under your spiritual guidance. And for me as a pastor, this is a huge weight. It's the reason I do and don't do certain things. It's the reason that I say or don't say certain things, is because I feel an obligation and a weight to live a life that people can look at and go, okay, this is a guy that I can look up to. I mean, I'm perfect. I'm very open and honest about my failures and my faults, but what it means is that I want people to be able to look to me and go, okay, this is someone that I want to kind of model parts of my life after, because I see that they're taking care of certain things. They're acting wisely. They're careful with what they say. They're kind. They're gentle. All those things, and we're going to talk about some of that in a minute, okay? But again, he's just reminding them how powerful the tongue is. And he goes on in verse 6. He says, the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on fire by hell itself. And so he is expounding on this rebuke and warning against the tongue. He talks about here the whole body. We don't actually know that this could actually mean two different things. It could mean the individual, right? That this is the whole body as an individual, or it could mean the church, or it could mean both. We don't really know. It doesn't really matter. The reality is that the tongue is dangerous, and that there are some warnings that he's giving as a part of this, that it can set on fire the entire course of life, that it can completely change the direction of where you're going, and set on fire by hell. And no matter what it is, James is making clear the danger of a tongue that ultimately isn't claimed, or that isn't tamed. And I think we see this in life, right? You think about great people of the past, good or bad, right? But great people of the past, whether that's, I'm here in Texas. And so, um, if you've got a Billy Graham, right, who's a great preacher who impacted millions and millions and millions of people through his words and his kindness. And he was the same person behind the scenes that he was up on stage, and that his job and his goal was to lead people to Jesus, right? He did incredible things with his voice, and his voice mattered to a lot of people. And then you got another guy. His name is David Koresh. I think there's actually a show out, maybe HBO or something like that on it. Waco, maybe Paramount Plus and Showtime. That I was just watching it. I grew up a little bit. I was young when the David Koresh stuff happened in Waco, and what it was this guy who essentially was the leader of a cult, and that he convinced people through the use of his words, through the use of his charisma, to do awful things and to ultimately create this horrific ending and murder and all this sort of stuff, right? That he did awful things with the tongue, but his tongue was extremely powerful. And we see that throughout history, right? That there are some of the worst people in the world are often some of the most charismatic or some of the most influential. And so you have to be aware of the power of your words, number one, and then you also be aware of the power of who you're listening to. That there are teachers, that there are preachers, that there are churches that aren't being honest, that aren't teaching the Bible, that are teaching things that are false. The Bible would call them false teachers. Then we have to be careful of those things, because the words have power, and they have power to give life, and they have power to destroy life. And so we have to be aware of what we're taking in, and we have to be aware of what we're saying to others. So maybe if you're not a teacher, maybe it's that you're a friend, or maybe that you're a parent, or maybe it's that you're a mentor to somebody. It's somebody. I was a student pastor for 20 years, and I tell our students all the time that you are a leader to somebody. I promise you, you are an influencer to somebody. You may not even know who that person is, but there's somebody who's watching you. It may be a little brother, it may be someone younger in a grade, it may be someone at your work, it may be but there is someone in your life. I promise you that you are an influencer too. And so, in the same way, while you may not be called to teach, as James is saying here, you're still an influencer. And you're going to have the ability to have power over your words, and power in those words to either create life or to destroy life. And so, it's really important. Now we kind of look at it when we look at what is ultimately the goal, is that our goal is to be what Galatians 5:22-23 says, right? It's the fruits of the Spirit. And so it's the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Almost said the song, right? If you grew up at church, you might know the song that helped you remember those things. But what we're going to see is that if a speaker is ultimately giving those things, then it's good. And if they're not giving those things, and we're going to talk about what else it can be, then it's bad. And so we have to be aware that the tongue can ultimately destroy all of those things. Gentleness, love, joy, peace, the tongue can destroy that. Kindness, the tongue absolutely can destroy that. Self-control, and that is the challenge, right? Is when we're not self-controlled with our tongue, it can destroy our witness. So the tongue is powerful. Again, okay, moving on. You're gonna hear that a lot. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. And so James here is saying in verse 7 that even every beast and bird, every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind. Oh, he's saying, listen, it doesn't matter what animal it is, that we can tame the animals, right? That we can control the animals. We have that power. We have that ability. But he goes on in verse 8, no human no human being can tame the tongue. That's something that is extremely hard for us to do. It's a restless evil full of deadly poison. It's just sitting and waiting. And what we're going to see is that often it's out of the heart that the flow of our mouth comes. It's out of our hearts that we see these things that we're saying, and that's going to have power good or bad. Okay, so verse 9 and 10, this is really important. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God, from whom the same mouth, or from the same mouth came come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. He's given this really clear kind of point and illustration that the tongue kind of what the problem is, right? That on one side, we bless God, right? We give God praises, we give God thanks. We exclaim who God is. We proclaim the power and the awesomeness of who God is. And yet, with the same instrument, with the same tool, with the same tongue, what does he say? He says, we also curse. So I'm going to do that in red. We also bring cursing. That's with one side, we bless our Lord, and from the other side, we curse our brother. That from one side we bless, from the other side we curse. And so, from one side we curse others. And again, what is James trying to get us throughout this entirety of the book? What is he trying to get us to understand? To love God and love others. That's what we're called to do. We can't do that if we are ultimately cursing others. You can't do the love part. And ultimately, you can't love God if you're cursing others, which I'll talk about here in just a minute. But the whole point that he's trying to say here is that from the same tool, from the same tongue, we curse men while we praise God. And what's kind of heartbreaking about it is that we forget that it's people who are made in the likeness of God, that Genesis 1:26-27, that we are made in the image of God. And so we curse them, and by doing so, it's as if we are cursing God, and how devastating it is, and how often we ultimately forget that we are made in the likeness, we are all made in the likeness of God. So we're commanded to bring forth peace, not hatred. James is trying to show his readers why it's important to love God and to love others. And what that doesn't mean is that we have to agree on everything. What it doesn't mean is that we can't stand for truth. Jesus was obviously the greatest example. He loved well, but he never compromised on truth. He never compromised on God's truth, but he did it in such a way, and he shared it in such a way that it was known that he was a loving and kind person. And that was ultimately what terrified the Pharisees so much, is that he's speaking this truth that's coming against their religious beliefs and their religious kind of doctrine. And yet people are believing it. People are buying into it. People are understanding it because he's doing it in such a way that is convicting, but also doing it in love. And his example is in love. And ultimately, James is saying that you can't praise God on one side and curse your brother on the other. Now, why is that? What does the Bible say? So I want to have a reference, and I'm going to read it to you, even though I won't pull it up here, but I'm going to read it to you. And it's 1 John. 1 John, I keep seeing the screen flash. I apologize about that if it's doing that to you guys. But we see it, 1 John 4, 7-12, and then 19-21. And here's what it says. It says, "Dear friends, let us continue to love one another, for love comes from God. Anyone who loves is a child of God and knows God, but anyone who does not love does not know God, for God is love." That love originates with God, because God first showed love to us. God showed how much he loved us by sending his one and only Son into the world so that we might have eternal life through him. This is real love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as a sacrifice to take away our sins. That God ultimately gave us the example of what love looks like. That us, as sinful, broken, disobedient people that have turned our backs on God, that God still chose to send Jesus to die for our sins. Dear friends, he goes on in verse 11, says, since God loved us that much, we surely ought to love each other. No one has ever seen God, but if we love each other, God lives in us, and his love is brought to full expression in us. If you jump down to verse 19, it says, we love each other because he loved us first. If you got your Bible and you turn over to 1 John 4, underline verse 19, highlight verse 19. We love each other because he loved us first. If someone says I love God but hates a fellow believer, that person is a liar. For if we don't love people we can see, how can we love God whom we cannot see? He has given us the command that those who love God must also love their fellow believers. That we can't speak out of both sides of our mouth. That's not how it works. That's not how it works. And without getting too political, that's the most heartbreaking thing that I see in our world today. Is there's nothing but screaming and yelling on both sides. That there's no ability to talk peaceably, to have disagreements, but to still love each other. And our tongues are leading that charge. You'll notice a change in our culture, and it started with the tongues. It started with this bitterness and with this rage, whether real or not. It started with our words, and it's carried into our hearts. And now we just see this constant tension between people, between races, between socioeconomic group, between political groups, between families, between all these different people, that we see this tension. And it started with our words. It starts with our tongues. So we go on in verse 11, 12, and it says, does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grapevine produce figs? Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water. He's emphasizing the point that he just made. You can't curse God, or you can't love God, bless God, give praises to God, and curse people. Those things don't go hand in hand. You can't do those things. Those are not natural things together. Love God, love others. That's our command. All right, let's keep going on. A couple more verses here. And so we're going on to verse 13. It says, who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. Make sure I finish that verse there. So he's going to go on, and how James has kind of done it in the point, and up to this point, is he starts out a chapter kind of specific, or chapter. James didn't write in chapters, but he starts what we have as chapters, right? That he starts out with something pretty specific, a pretty specific point that he's trying to make, and then the second part of our chapters that he kind of spreads that out and goes to a more general statement, but still a very practical truth, but kind of expands it out and goes a bit more general. And so he starts off in verse 13. He says, who is wise and understanding among you? Now here's the deal, is that ultimately this is who we want to be, right? We think about someone who's wise and who has understanding. That's who we want to be. So that's part of it. But then the other part of it is that's ultimately who we want around us as well. And so if you think about the people in your life, who is someone that you consider wise, that you consider as someone who, when they speak, you listen, because the things that they say have power, and come from a place of wisdom and discernment. And so we want these people around us. And the reality is part of the reason that you think they're wise is their words, but it's also their conduct. It's also the way that they live their lives. If you were to listen to someone say wise things, but then they turn around and they do foolish things, you wouldn't ultimately believe that person. You would ultimately listen less to the things they say, because the things they do don't match the things that they say. And so, in one of the ways that you can test kind of this wisdom, whether it's in yourself or within others, is this word right here, meekness. Oh, still have the highlighter on. It's this word, meekness. Now, meekness is a word that we don't use in today's world very often. We don't use it in normal conversations, but meekness essentially means, I'm going to run out of space here. Gentleness is how we often substitute it, or humility. There's someone who is meek is often a person who is also gentle, or someone who's humble. And so those words often kind of describe it. And we actually can see this from Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. He said, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. The meekness is substituted for gentleness and humility. And here it would describe someone who, even in times of distress or potential anger, has an ability to find perspective and bring peace to a situation. right? That's someone that you think about meekness. That's a characteristic of that. They're often the cooler heads in the room, right? The cooler heads in crazy situations. That there's someone who can kind of bring a gentleness in a relationship, even if they're being attacked. They can bring a gentleness and a calm and a peace about it. They never try and boast themselves up falsely. They're humble in their successes. This is the kind of person that you're looking to be and to surround yourself with. But something I also want to say as a part of this, that meekness does not equal weakness. And I think that's one of the challenges. When we think of strength, we think of loud, we think of proud, we think of bold, we think of aggressive. That I think in our culture today, when we think of strength, we think of people that don't let other people push them around. And meek doesn't mean weak. All right. So just because if I'm a person who's meek doesn't mean that I'm not going to sit there and get into a fight, right, over something that you say. What it means is that I'm the bigger person, and then I'm going to step back, and I'm going to have a cool head, and I'm going to bring peace into the situation. I'm going to try and bring peace into the situation, that I'm ultimately not worrying about reacting to you. Is that what I'm doing is I'm trying to be obedient to God. And so meekness is a part of that. Going on, verse 14. And here's what it says in verse 14 to 16. It says, "But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not wisdom that comes from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder in every vile practice." That he gives us these two words. He gives us jealousy and selfish ambition, this putting you first, right? These are things that ultimately they're not from God. They're not from God. And so these are not the characteristics that we want to display. These are not the things that we want to have in our lives, because ultimately this is not going to be someone that is wise and that is discerning and that is meek and gentle and humble. It's just going to be the opposite of that. Now, again, James is writing specifically to teachers here as a part of this section, that he's saying specifically as teachers, I need you to make sure that you are not jealous of other people, of other people's successes, of other people's influence and authority, of other people's power and position. That I need you to be gentle and wise, right? But I need you to also not be selfish. Is that jealousy and selfishness creates, or are not from God, and create a horrible effect. It says that this is not the wisdom that comes from above, right? Just like I wrote there, not from God, but it's earthly, it's unspiritual, and it's demonic. That this is something that comes from Satan, this jealous and selfish ambition. It says in verse 16, where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder in every vile practice. And if you think about religious leaders that have failed, if you think about people in their own life that have failed, morally had a major failure. And I can think of, numerous religious leaders, whether I knew them personally or I knew of them because they had a great influence and they had a big voice in kind of the culture that I'm in as part of a religious leader and a teacher and a pastor, that all of their failures started out typically with some sort of selfish ambition, desire, some reason that they began to walk away from the truth. Maybe they were jealous, maybe they were selfish, whatever it was, that it starts with those things in their heart, and then they begin to walk away from the truth. And at some point, they get so far away from where they know they should be that the only thing left is the failures that are continually coming, and they get bigger and they grow, and they ultimately become life shattering. The number of marriages that I've seen destroyed because of selfish actions, the number of ministries that I've seen destroyed because of jealousy, are countless. I mean, it's just that there's so many numerous things, and the thing is that we must surround ourselves with people who will speak truth in our lives, even if it hurts. The part of being a wise person isn't being alone, but rather putting people in your life that will call you out on your own stuff, call you out on the ways that you're failing, call you out on the ways that you're being selfish. I have a group of people. In my life that I've called up before and been frustrated and kind of vented to. One of the times he goes, "You do realize you're being ridiculous, right? That this is actually your fault." And I was like, "Oh." And he just called it as it was. And he was right. And I didn't want to hear it. And I wanted to kind of push back on it. But I needed that in my life. I needed that voice in my life because that ultimately set me back in the right direction. And when we don't have that, when we don't have people that are checking us, or if we do have people that are checking us and we're not listening to them, then ultimately we begin to get off the path that God has us on, to a point that the failures begin to get bigger and the destruction begins to get greater. And so the quicker we can get back on that path, the quicker we can be quick to realize that our hearts aren't in line with God's and that our actions aren't in line with God's, is better. It's going to allow our failures and our mistakes to be smaller and have less life altering consequences and life altering changes. So very, very important. Okay, verse 17. And this one, I'm going to highlight this one. I highlighted it in this Bible, but then I also got it in my other Bible here as well. It says, but the wisdom, let me highlight it first, and then I'll read it. But the wisdom from above is first pure, and then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. So he gives us several words here. So he's talking about the wisdom from above, right? He just talked about this wisdom that's not from above, that's demonic and unspiritual, that is rooted in selfishness and jealousy. But this wisdom that's from above is first pure, and then it's peaceable, and then it's gentle, and then it's open to reason. It's full of mercy. It produces good fruits. It's impartial, and it's sincere. So let's look at these things real quick. Is that when it's pure, it's free of defilements, right? It's free of things that make it unpure. I don't know another way to say that, right? Is that it's clean as a part of it. When it's peaceable, is that it's peace loving. It's kind of another way to say it. That it's peace loving. That it's someone who wants to make peace with others. That when it's gentle, it's not a weakness as we talked about earlier, but it's considerate of others. And we could use a little bit more on that in our world today, couldn't we? When it's open to reason, it's not someone who's so hard-headed that they can't see past their own foolishness or their own weaknesses and their own opinions, that their own faults and their own opinions, to see the truth that someone else is speaking. Is that it's someone who's willing to yield to reasonable requests. It's someone who's willing to listen to reason. Again, we could use a bit more in that in our world today. It's someone who's full of mercy, someone who's actively sympathetic to those who are in need. When you see someone in need, do you begin to get judgmental? Do you go, "Oh, well, I bet they deserve that," or "Oh, well, that sucks for them," right? Or does your heart break for them? Do you have empathy? Do you have compassion on them? Does your heart move by them? Full of mercy is someone who's actively sympathetic to those in need. Good fruits is it someone who has good works for others to see. James's book has pushed so hard on this that our faith needs to have works, not to save us, but so that it's effective, so that it's powerful, so it has the ability to change our life and others' lives. And so it needs to have good fruits. And so this wisdom that comes from God has good fruits. It produces good fruits that other people can see. It's impartial. It's not a single-minded. This is describing like a single-mindedness in their devotion to God. That they're not double-minded, or as we mentioned earlier, where they'll bless God but curse people. That there's this single-mindedness, that is their devotion is committed to God, not to their own pursuits, not to their own desires, but it's someone who's desiring God and God's will on their life above all else. And then it's sincere. It's someone without hypocrisy. It's someone who is true to who they present themselves to be. And that's a lot of things, but kind of like the fruits of the Spirit. It's a good checklist for us to look at to go, okay, am I doing well? Especially as a teacher, especially as a pastor. These are things that I need to be looking at and going, man, am I being gentle? Or am I not in a situation? Am I being full of mercy? Am I seeing people and having compassion on them? Or am I getting so busy with things in my own life that I don't have time to care about others? And that means I'm too busy. That means I'm too busy if I can't see the needs and be sympathetic to the needs of others. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge. It's a good list for us to look at. Verse 18, last one. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. If you're a teacher, please know that your words matter, that your voice matters. How you speak to God and how you speak about God and about His Word absolutely matters. If you speak through hatred and through lies, that ultimately the Bible's clear that you're going to reap the same things that you sow, that you're going to reap the same things that you teach. You're going to reap a people around you that are hateful and that tell lies and that are only destroying things around them. But if you teach in peace, and if you are wise, as it says here in James 3, that you'll see a harvest of righteousness, a harvest of holiness, not just in your life, but in the lives of the people that you're influencing, the lives of the people that you're speaking to. That's my hope as a pastor. Isn't that I become the greatest or the most famous or the most wealthy or the most well-known, even within my own town. What I desire above all else is that the people that I lead, the people that I care about, the people that are involved in my church, that they grow in their love for God and their love for others. And so my heart beats with what James is saying here, right on, because I've seen the power of words and I've seen how it destroys lives and it destroys people and it ultimately can destroy a ministry and can destroy an influence. But man, I've seen even in my own ministry the power of good that it can have and the hope that it can bring to a hopeless situation. As I'm sitting with a family whose daughter tried to commit suicide, and we're praying and I'm giving verses, or I'm just trying to be there to be with them, to speak truth and God's love and grace and mercy in a situation. I've seen lives turn around for good. Is that I've seen so much good come when I speak good, godly things, wise and discerning things. Hateful words breed hateful hearts, but compassionate words breed compassionate hearts. That's the thing that James wants you to get in chapter 3. All right, so that's chapter 3. I'm gonna text the crew. So what we do as a second part of this is that we hang out with our crew of guys, and we talk about it. We talk about what we're learning, what God's showing us, and we try and do it through just the proper way of reading the Bible, an expository way of kind of read the Bible. So I'm gonna hop in there. So if you give me a minute here, we're gonna hop in with the guys so that we can talk about what they saw, not just in chapter 3, but actually in chapter 2 as well, because that was a part of it last week, and we didn't get to have our conversation last week. So give me a minute here to hop into the Discord, and we can go. But I encourage you, man, if you're listening and you're watching this now or later, let me know what you're learning. Let me know what God is showing you, what God is putting on your heart and challenging you with as a part of this, because I think it's really important that we're communicating what God's doing. It's encouraging and it's insightful as a part of it. So, I didn't think about, okay, let me do this. All right, I need to flip my video, but I don't know how to do that.
I think so.
Hey, can y'all hear me? Do you know how to flip a video in Zoom?
In Zoom, no.
How to? What do you mean flip it?
I don't think you can in Zoom.
My camera's upside down. because
Oh,
it's
it's
the best
upside
way for
down.
it to it's the best way for it to fit, but
Oh,
I can't I can mirror it, but I can't actually flip it. Oh wait, yeah, I can. Ah, all right, I'm good. Okay. All
In
right, let me.
Zoom, you can?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
If you go into the settings, under the video settings, you can actually, in the top right corner of your video, you can flip it.
oh yeah.
Look at there. We're all learning something new today.
Which one is it?
It's a little icon
Which
in the
setting is
top
it?
right
Under your video setting.
in the preview, the video
Yeah.
preview.
In my like in my
So
little
it's-
box?
Yeah, no. So go to the where you can stop the camera feed. Go to that, hit video settings,
Oh, okay.
in the preview, this top right icon.
Oh, weird.
There you
How do you
go.
flip it?
You just
You
did.
just did.
Yeah.
You just
No,
went
no.
360.
Mirror. There we go.
Okay. So,
This
I
is way
know
better.
Corey
Stuff is
may
actually readable.
Corey may join us hopefully here in a little bit. We'll see how that goes. But so we're jumping back to chapter 2. We're starting off with this idea of sin of partiality. What I don't know. Brandon, did you watch the teaching thing part of it last week, or that I did on Monday?
Yeah,
Or
I
a
did,
section of
not,
it?
Yeah,
Not the whole thing, but the part of it.
Yeah.
Ryan, didn't know if you had time either, but I don't know if I needed to summarize it back up or if we just want to jump into it.
A summary.
Okay.
Just a short summary.
Yeah. Well, and the idea of this first sin of partiality is that that he's warning against having preferential treatment of one person over another. And he's using the example of rich versus poor, but that how God doesn't see a difference between them, but yet so often we treat them differently, and that when we do that, we're not like God, we're not representing God. That rich doesn't equal godly. In fact, often that it's poor that God blesses more so than the rich. But kind of what I talked about was this idea of we're all sinners. Romans 3:23. We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and that Christ's ultimate example is to love God and to love others, and that you can't love others if you're separating out who you can love or who you will love based on what they can provide to you. So, what are some things that kind of stood out to y'all, or that maybe God was putting in your heart for that part of it? Or maybe what are some distinctions that you've made with people? 'Cause I certainly know I've made some in the past myself.
I think
In
we're
the
all
sense where you
prone
treat
to.
them different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're all prone to that to some extent. I mean, it's. I think for me, it's something I try and actively, like empathy is a big thing that I try and hit on with myself and my kids and stuff. Like it's a big character trait that we try and hit on, and I think part of that is not treating anybody different because of what they can offer me or whatever, or what they're going through or whatever. Like putting myself in their position, in their shoes. I think that's one thing that we've tried to do.
Yeah, that's good. I think it's a good way to kind of fight against it is
Yeah.
especially on the side of people that you would think less of naturally than people you would, go, oh, well, this person has. I think my challenge is sometimes thinking that, oh, this person has it all and has it all together, and maybe spend too much time trying to get that person's attention or that person's respect when I do that at the cost of other people at times.
Yeah. So in a sense, it's like, the passage talks about kind of speaks to the person as like a high level, talking to people that are the same level as them and people that are in a society sense lower than them, and then putting those lower people in this area and those. But like, I think what you're saying is like it's kind of like the inverse, where the
Yeah.
partiality is like I'm trying to be up to, like, I'm categorizing people, but I'm categorizing me in the low side, and then there's people over here in the high side that I'm trying to be or whatever.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. And I think if we if the more time we spend with the people that are lower, and I mean, James is obviously speaking to rich and poor, which at this
Right.
time would have had a huge weight of it, but I don't think it's any different for us either. And I don't think it's, and rich may also include, for them at this time, rich included power and authority. And so I think that that's often how we view it as well. But it's when you spend time with the people at the bottom that's, yeah, you're showing empathy and that kind of stuff, but you're also, I think, revealing that you're not any different. Like, you're revealing in your own heart that I'm not that much different than they are.
Right.
And that's the thing that people will never say about me, because I won't ever have a ton of money, but the thing that I love to hear about people is when I find out that they have a lot of money, to be able to say, but you would never know it, right? That's kind of the
Right.
thing that you want to have of someone who's wealthy or whatever, that they have it, but you would never know it, because the way that they live or the way that they treat people, there's no difference. It doesn't matter what you have. They're kind and they're good people.
Yep.
I think I'm kind of along what you were saying, John, and it's almost the opposite perspective that is talked about in James, but it's more of a, I often view other people higher than myself, not in like a trying to be selfless way, although that's good, but more in a like, I'm not as competent or professionally gifted or as far along in my career type of scenario.
Right.
And in that sense, I approach other people as if they're more well established in their role, or maybe at times defer to whatever they, whatever direction they think is best, when I shouldn't be.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's hard to explain.
No,
but
I
it's
mean,
like
that
in
makes,
that-
because I would say
that's
that's
not the
such a,
way.
yeah, it's that's like when you, God has gifted you at something, but yet you don't believe it enough. We've talked to students before. I'm making sure I get the words right here. That like, woe is me is not godly either, because when you have too low of a view of yourself, it's because you have a low view of God. You could be
Right.
too arrogant and too prideful, but if you go on the other direction, then ultimately it's because you have a low view of God and what God can do in your life, which isn't good either. It's just the other side of that direction. So, yeah. What's up, Corey? Welcome.
Hey, hello.
Okay. Anything else that we wanted to add to the sin of partiality? Corey, I don't know if you want to add anything to that part of it.
I ended up missing the question, so
No. We were just talking about that first section of chapter 2, the sin of partiality, and how James is writing about people who prefer the rich, even though the rich often oppress them and are worse to them, versus the poor, and that there is this difference, and that by doing that is not of God or from God, but in fact, it's the opposite of who God is and what he does.
yeah, I think it's kind of along the same lines as what Brandon was saying. It's hard. It's hard if you like. I think it was in one of the Francis Chan series. He was talking about what happens if you see like a celebrity or something. It's hard not to kind of like get kind of giddy, right? Excited. Somebody that you see, you hold them in high regard and stuff like that. I don't know. It's a hard thing to not try and make sure that you're not doing.
Well, and I don't even think that that's a huge deal. It's that if that begins to influence how we, like, if we then lean towards that instead of helping someone else, like,
Yeah.
or if we're giving them preferential things, and especially like James says, when they don't deserve it, that they're actually not good people, but yet we just are loving them because of their celebrity status or whatever. So,
Yeah.
because I don't necessarily, I think that there's a respect and an honor of coming in contact with people that are great people, whether that's famous people or godly people or whatever. That I think there's some that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's if it carries beyond that to
Yeah.
actually influencing us in how we respond, it becomes a bad thing. Well, I think it for me, it the thing that you see so much throughout James is the gospel, which is really interesting because I didn't remember that through other times that I've read through it. But in verse, I guess that's I can't see because I highlighted things and wrote over what ended up being numbers. But verse 9, where verse 8 talks about if you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you're doing well. But in verse 9 it says, if you show partiality, you're committing a sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For in verse 10, whoever keeps the whole law but fails at one point has become guilty of it all. That he's just giving the gospel. It's just reminding people that you are not good. Romans 3, that no one is good, no, not one. And I think that's something I think I've missed in previous times is he's often, we see it in chapter 3 too, that he's pointing to the gospel. So, okay, all right. Second part, faith without works is dead. Now, I don't know if y'all watched my part. I don't know what Francis Chan said in the video as a part of it, but I think that this is often a misunderstood passage and is a very important theological passage to understand what James is saying and what he's not saying. So, do you want me to summarize or do y'all want to just jump in? I don't want to take up time summarizing if y'all feel like
Yeah,
you got a pretty
we
good
can
grasp on it.
Yeah, we can jump in.
All right.
One thing that I was thinking about, something we talked about before, is having that vertical versus horizontal worship and relationship with God and with other Christ believers and lost people as well. But the vertical and the horizontal factor, I think the horizontal is where that works comes in. It's not gonna necessarily bring you any closer to God just because you're doing works, but it should be a horizontal like evidence and outcome of the vertical relationship you have with God.
Yeah, that's really good. I like that.
Yeah, it's like if your faith is only for yourself, then it's dead
Mm-hmm.
because that's not the intention. The intention for our faith and our relationship with God is to love and serve God and worship God, but also serve other people and be be an example of Christ, be a light in the world, like all those things that the gospel talks about. The Great Commission, like
Yeah.
that's what we're called to do. And so if all we do is show up at church and read our Bible and have quiet times and do all that, but we have no works that are evidence of the relationship with God, then it is dead.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One thing I wrote down that was a quote from Tony Evans. He says, "What you believe about eternity will become real in your history." So essentially, meaning what you believe about eternity, about Christ, and what your faith there is going to determine and become real in your history. So it's going to be evident by what you've done.
That's good.
By the faith that you have.
That's really good. What about you, Corey? Anything that stood out?
Yeah, I mean, I know some people really get fixated on the whole works thing. Like, I've got to be doing, I've got to be doing this, I've got to be doing that, X, Y, and Z. If I can check this off, then that's what's ultimately going to save me. But really, I think if your relationship with Christ is where it's supposed to be, all that stuff's going to come naturally. You're not going to have to fixate like I've got to do this and this and this, because at least in my opinion, ultimately, if you're fixating on doing these works to get into heaven, I don't feel like you're doing it in the right mindset, and you're doing it for yourself, and you're not supposed to be doing any of this for yourself. You're supposed to be doing it for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, that's good. And I think that's somewhere that I've struggled in the past is not that I believe that my salvation is because of my works, but that I'm trying to work off my salvation, that I'm trying to earn my this side of my salvation now. And so as a people pleaser, that I'm trying to please God by doing enough good things that he would say, okay, now I'm glad I saved you, kind of thing. And so I think there's been times in my life where that's where I struggle, is kind of in that midsection. We're talking about, in verse 18 and 18, where he's saying, speaking about the guy who's making the argument against him, and saying, you have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. That it's the works that are kind of the catalyst to that faith, and not in a godly way. That that works are necessary to prove salvation, and that I think sometimes that's a trap as a people pleaser I fall into, is that I do works to try and prove my salvation when that's not helpful to me, and it's not ultimately what it's not why God saved me, so that I can try and prove that that he made a good decision. That's not.
Yeah.
He saved me because I can't make the right decision, because I'm stupid, because I fail all the time every day. Like that's why he saved me, because I can't save myself.
I think one of the things, just the fact that the only way to truly be transformed by God's word is by action. It's really hard if you don't have action to allow God to transform your heart and your character and relationships that you have with others and things like that. It's impossible without action.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the callback that James uses back to Abraham, Old Testament, talking about Isaac. Like that is the perfect example. Like Abraham's faith produced the work to go bring Isaac up the hill, and was going to obey what God was telling him to do. And so that's the perfect example. Like he had enough faith that it produced the works, rather than the works producing faith or producing salvation or helping us, look good in the eyes of God. Like, no, it's just you have the faith that, and then out of that faith is produced these things.
Yeah. And again, I think that's where we go. We have to ground ourselves in that theology of it, so that it's really important to understand that otherwise you get into the works-based salvation, that it's
Right.
not faith alone, it's faith plus whatever, fill in the blank, baptism, the second blessing, whatever it is that you want to add to it, it's faith plus some works. And that's ultimately not scriptural. That's, and from even the Old Testament time, not just New Testament. And that's from the Old Testament time, that faith was considered faithful because he believed God. And it was counted to him as righteous, as holy. And so, yeah, no, that's really good.
I think a lot of times too, I have to, like, in those moments, I have to do like motivation checks, when I'm doing something that, either I did something that it feels good to do a good thing, like, or whatever, I'm doing a thing. Sometimes it's good for me to check the motivations of why I'm doing it, just to make sure that I'm doing it for those right reasons.
Yeah, that's good. All right. Anybody want to add anything else to that part? No. All right, chapter 3. Well, I just finished this one, so if you didn't listen, sucks to be you. Okay. So taming the tongue. We'll talk about that part first, and then we'll go into kind of the wisdom from above. But what's your challenge? Is this something that you've struggled with? Is this something that's that you, and obviously, as I talked about in the teaching, he's writing to teachers, to what I would say now are pastors and spiritual leaders, but that it's a general truth that also counts for any believer, especially people that are in a position of influence over someone else, which, as I said, is actually everybody, even if you don't realize it. But you guys, as dads, as husbands, have certainly a lot that you'll be held responsible for that. So where have you seen the tongue be good and bad, maybe in your own life or in people's lives around you? How have you seen the tongue, their words, make an example of their heart, I guess?
I mean, I think as parents, it's with your kids. Kids can be frustrating, and there are times you let that frustration boil over into an ill-advised, snap at your kids, or like whatever it is. I've found myself multiple times having to go back to my kids and be like, you know what, I shouldn't have said that, or I was frustrated about something else, or whatever. Like, my words in that moment were not directed at you, they weren't because of you, like, and have to like ask for forgiveness from them. And I think that's where the reading this passage, what kind of God brought up to me is like just words to my kids, how powerful those are, good and bad, how
Mm-hmm.
powerful those are. And
Mm-hmm.
taming the tongue, like it was both sides of it. It was the negative side of like, hey, you need to make sure you watch that, your kids, but also the positive side, like, hey, I need to make sure I reinforce and encourage my kids as well, because it's both sides that are just as powerful.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Brandon or Corey?
Yeah, I mean, kind of along the same line, just continuing to remind myself the contradiction that it is when, like Ryan said, have moments where you speak a little sharply to your kids when you probably don't need to, and then, jump on something like this and be like, oh, this is what I learned from God. And after I had just, got on to my
Oh,
kids and was a little, probably too harsh on them. So yeah, just the reminder of the contradiction of that. But one thing when we were talking about teachers, one thing that I don't think I've really even considered or thought of is the fact that, like, I always read that, and my head would always think he's talking about pastors, people in like vocational ministry and leadership positions within the church and that kind of stuff. But really, like, I think, like you said, it's everybody that he's talking about. If you're not a teacher, but if you are teaching in any capacity, you have
mm-hmm.
to understand the weight of that and what kind, what that carries,
Mm-hmm.
and knowing that if I try to give godly counsel or pass on godly wisdom to somebody, I need to make sure that before I do that, I am in a correct relationship with God and in a, in line with what God would truly want me to be saying, because that carries a lot of weight. And I don't think I recognize that when I give advice or try to give counsel to somebody. I don't think I recognize that just because I'm not a pastor
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that's not something that God views as very important.
Right. Yeah, and that God's gonna. What I feel like God's gonna ultimately hold you responsible for that.
Yeah.
Uh, that's a scary thing. Uh, that's a heavy thing.
Yeah.
That should sit
Mhm.
heavy on us. I mean, that's not a
And I
bad thing
always
at
just
all.
felt and I would have just mentally think, oh, the burden's on the pastor, but not really, because I'm,
Sucks to be
in home
them.
group and stuff, you're giving counsel to your home
Right.
group,
Right. Yeah.
couples and stuff. So
Yeah.
it's on all of us.
Yeah. What about you, Corey?
Yeah, what Brandon said is exactly what I was thinking. He said it a lot better than what I was gonna say it. But the first thing I thought of was like, wow, when John reads this, or I'm sure you've read this a lot of times before. John, like, it made me think like how much weight is on yours, our
Right.
preacher, everybody's preacher, and you're like, oh my gosh, like he's just calling you out like right now, like
Uh-huh.
this is not for everybody, and
Uh-huh.
if you don't feel like you can do it, do not do it, because there's a lot of responsibility that sits on you.
Yeah.
But exactly like Brandon said, I started to think it's not like anyone is a teacher at any point in time. Like if somebody were to come to me and like, hey, tell me about Christ, like I want to come to him, like I'm a teacher right then and there, and like there's a lot of responsibility on you to make sure that you're telling him the right thing, him or her the right thing, and that you're getting it right and it's all biblically sound. Like it's just a lot of pressure.
Mm-hmm. Well,
More
and I
pressure
think
for you though. So
it is. I think that's, yeah. And what's funny is the number of people that I have seen in 20 years of ministry that get into it and that ultimately fail because they weren't up to the pressure, and not because like they had a big fail, like, oh, I dropped out, but because it's hard, and because that it's not always fun. And I had a long conversation this week about a situation that's it's uncomfortable and it's awkward and it's hard, and it's like, oh man, like what is God, what is wise counsel in this, and what are you supposed to do? And then and then you go hang out with more, but it's just it's hard. And I think from the pastor perspective, what is helpful for us is when people say things that are encouraging. We hear very little encouragement. And so, I'm lucky to be at a church that from the top of our leadership structure, from our elders, all the way down from fellow staff members to the people in the church, they're extremely encouraging. but that's not the norm. And so, um, I would say that your pastor can all, even if your pastor doesn't know you, the encouragement of, hey, I just want you to know that I've really grown a lot spiritually since being under your teaching, and I just appreciate that. Or, just something, man, that goes a long, 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 long ways into encouraging us because it is hard and it feels like we set more things on fire than we actually do lead well. So, yeah,
So I got a question.
yeah.
It talks about, teachers are, at least the way that I interpret it, will be judged with greater strictness.
Hmm.
So eh, we just started talking about how technically we're all teachers, me and Brandon and Ryan, but like your job is to be a teacher as well. Does that mean like what you're doing, John, if you're not doing it with the right conviction, and if I'm not doing the right conviction because you are an actual teacher, like you're going to be judged even stricter, or
Yes, I
like what
think
does
that
that mean?
I think he's specifically talking to religious leaders. I don't think
Okay.
he's talking to like the general. I think there's a general truth we can take from it, and so it has to be like on one of those kind of exegesis, eisegesis. We were talking about this last night at church, like the differences in how you kind of get to a passage. That the goal is to understand what James was trying to say to the people he was writing to, and then also understanding that there are general truths in here that we can take for ourselves as well. But
Right.
like, you don't have to put yourself to go, Corey, you shouldn't become a teacher for, what, because he's not talking to like every person individually. He's specifically talking to teachers,
Yeah.
religious leaders. And so, yeah, and I do truly, and I have felt this in my spirit before, that I truly believe that I will be judged by the way that I have led people, and that when I don't do a good job of that, that I do believe that God will hold me more accountable because of that. Because if and Jesus spoke to it a tremendous amount with the Pharisees, that they were the
Yeah.
shepherds leading their sheep astray, and that he talks about if anyone um, whatever hurts the faith of a child, right? That they should have a rock thrown around them and thrown into the. It would be better for them to have a rock tied around them and thrown into the bottom of the sea. That's harsh words, but that's the call and the responsibility, and we see it. And actually, a really good example is Moses, right? Moses Moses did more than one wrong thing, but Moses' mistake was that he hit the rock. And God, in that moment, said that disobedience, you're not going to be led into the kingdom. You won't see the promised land because of that. Okay, hey, that feels a little harsh, God. Like Moses, the guy who led him out of Egypt, the guy who had to deal with all these idiots for decades and decades and decades, and yet you're not going to let him in because of that. And for a long time, it felt frustrating. And then it's the reality to go, no, but this is the call that God says. Listen, if this is, I will. You are in this position of authority. I've given you this. That means I'm going to hold you accountable for it in the way that you treat it. And it makes you at times wonder if it's worth it. And so, and that's not a bad thing. That should be something that we always kind of think about. So, yeah, which is I think too where if you have a pastor that's flippant about their role, or a ministry leader that's just like whatever, man, that's a dangerous thing. That's a dangerous person. I would be very wary to be in that church or around that ministry leader, because someone who doesn't take it serious doesn't understand the responsibility they have, which means to me ultimately that they're not going to take serious the call that God's put on their life as a part
Yeah.
of it. So, yeah, that's a good
Yeah.
question.
Our pastor talks about that a lot from like during his preaching. Like he talks about how he feels the weight of that, but
Yeah,
that's a good thing, and that's where God's placed him. But like, yeah,
yeah.
I agree with your direction there. If you are under teaching of somebody that is flippant about it, like that's not good. They need to feel the weight of it.
Hmm. Well, and that's, I mean, I'm an executive pastor now, but the question right now is, well, when are you going to become a lead pastor, right? And that is
Mm.
maybe the thing that scares me the most, is that I am obviously with elders, but that I am responsible for an entire congregation, not just a ministry, but an entire congregation's spiritual
Yeah.
lives. And it doesn't mean I control them, but what it means is that God's going to hold me responsible for the things I do and the things I say. That is maybe one of the primary things that scares me away from that right now. So, because that the weight of that is significant. But do what?
It's a healthy fear.
Yeah, it is a very healthy fear. All right. Anything else on that?
Mhm.
I think for me, one of the things that just stood out that, again, the different things stand out at different times, but it's this idea of we're so often two-sided, that we bless God and yet we curse men, and it just this, man, we can't get it right sometimes, and the danger of that. And then I think just to when you sit there and you think about how words destroy lives, and that so often it starts with words. It starts with the "I don't love you anymore." It starts with, this or that, or "I'm not getting this from you." It starts with words in marriages and in families that ultimately people don't come back from. I think that for me, that sat really big this time in reading through this, is the devastation of your words. And again, that should bring some healthy fear as a part of it. But okay, all right. Wisdom from above, meekness. That a word you ever used in just hanging out with people?
Every
Meekness?
day.
Every
Yeah,
day.
like earlier today.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. All right. Okay, what are some things that stood out?
Now, one thing that I took, again, I know I think several of us have mentioned Francis Chan, but I think partly because we're going through that James series that he has alongside this, just for further depth. But one of the things that he mentions about wisdom specifically is he says wisdom isn't just head knowledge. Wisdom is really an applied knowledge. It has to do with action just as much as it does with intellect. And just that perspective on wisdom is that it's not, because a lot of times you tend to think of wisdom as a direct correlation to intelligence and being some wise person, but no, there's action that's just as involved, just as important in having wisdom as intellect is.
Yeah.
That's good.
I like the last verse. It's, "And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." I think so many times, like, we can just be so chaotic and destructive, and just that thought of, the righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Like, make peace, and you will see peace. Like, I don't know. I just like that thought.
Mm-hmm. That's good. What about you, Corey?
Yeah, a lot of what they're mentioning, the wisdom is not just intellect, but there's a lot of actions to it. And one thing that I thought was really cool, again, he hits on mercy, which is something that I think he had mentioned in first chapter. I think it's probably mentioned all throughout the Bible as mercy. Mercy
Yeah.
is like a huge
Yeah,
thing.
it is. It is.
And I don't know, it's pretty cool how some of this stuff is repeated, and it kind of it shows how important this is. Like, wisdom is repeated everywhere, mercy is repeated everywhere. Like, I mean, these are important things that we need to remember.
Yeah, that's good. Do you know the difference between mercy and grace? This is actually really good, and I'd say it's not like to see if you're stupid, but that I think it's I learned a simple definition a couple of years ago. It's like, oh, this helps me remember this always. What's the difference between mercy and grace? Because we use them interchangeably a lot, or do you not know? And you don't have to know. I mean, I feel like mercy is a Christian word.
First thing that comes to mind when I think of mercy, I think of war. It sounds really weird, but like
Mercy.
Gladiator, right?
Okay.
Caesar's like, show mercy or give him death,
Uh-huh.
Mercy is something
Isn't it,
taken away, and grace something given.
Wait. Say that again, Ryan.
Is mercy something taken away and grace something given?
Flip them. So mercy is
Flip 'em?
something, yeah, mercy is something that you're given that you don't deserve. Grace
Okay,
is
yeah, flip
something
'em.
that you're not
Yeah, so
given that you do deserve. So
that you
you
do deserve.
so
Right.
grace would be
Yeah.
the fact that we didn't receive punishment for our sin because that's what we deserved. Mercy is that God gave us salvation when we didn't deserve it, gave us freedom, gave us Christ. So again,
Yeah.
the words are very interchangeable, and we see them a lot in Scripture, and we use them a lot. And that's just a simple thing that I try to remember to define them. But you're right. I think mercy is a huge part of it. All right, who did I miss?
Yeah, I remembered
forgot.
why that.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just saying, I remembered why that last verse stuck out to me. Is so in our church we've been going through this series of wisdom and wonder is what's called, but we've been in this series for months. I don't know, like a long time, like 9 months or something. But one of the like phrases that they say throughout this is wisdom has a posture and it's low.
Mhm.
Wisdom has a pace and it's slow. And wisdom has a person, and it's Jesus. And then when I was reading that last verse about the peace, it just reminded me of like the pace of wisdom. And like, a lot of my life right now with my career stuff is like I'm seeking wisdom in a lot of different places. And there's one thing that Angela told me earlier is like I'm trying to figure out, some people that I might work with. But I'm trying to get conversations with them and trying to get things rolling fast or whatever. And Angela was like, wisdom is slow. It's like, dang.
Uh-huh.
Like, yep,
Uh-huh.
I need to slow down. Like I need to slow down. I need to bring that to God more and get my posture low
Yeah.
and bring my pace down and make it slow. Like, yeah.
That's really good. I hadn't thought about that before, but that wisdom is slow. That's when I respond quickly, very rarely, unless I get lucky, is it a wise response or reaction.
Yeah.
That when I slow is when I can find perspective, when I can listen and hear God's direction. So that's really good. That's really good. What's up, Judah?
That makes sense. If you think about when you, or at least for me, when I'm talking to somebody and trying to ask advice, I haven't really thought of that perspective, but now that I'm thinking about it, it makes sense that if they rattle off something pretty quickly, I'm probably not going to hang on to that as much as if somebody kind of sat there, took it in, and like maybe paused for 20, 30 seconds and then gave me the counsel.
Mm-hmm.
I'd probably just feel like that was more thought through and more weighty. I don't know. That's I never thought about that perspective of it.
Yeah.
That's good. All right, who did I miss? I know two of y'all talked, but I don't know who the third one was. Was it you, Brandon? You hadn't?
I think we all did.
I think,
Did everybody did? Okay. Well, for me, it goes to, on the negative side, it's just the reminder of, similar to the tongue, of the destruction of ministries, especially that's always starts with this selfish and jealous, bitter, whatever it is, but it starts with a selfish mindset. And it's so easy in ministry to get stuck there. It's so easy to look at the other churches in your area or the other pastors on your staff or the people that you listen to in podcasts or on shows, and you go, man, like, I wish I had what they did, or man, if I was at that church, it'd be easy. Or how about they don't have to deal with this stupid parent, that I got to deal with or whatever. And it's just that jealousy or the selfishness that, oh, this is about me, or, oh, I'm great, or, wow, they're lucky to have me. That all of those things, when I look at pastors, whether I know them or public failures, that selfishness is just rooted in it, and I have to be so careful not to be that, because that is such a natural, earthly, like, just nature part of who we are, is to be selfish. And as a teacher, as he started off the chapter with, I gotta be really, really, really careful to not do that, and have people that will call me out on crap in my life. That's a huge part of it. But
Yeah.
And in James, he doesn't really beat around the bush on that either. He calls it
No.
demonic.
Yeah.
He goes pretty far with it.
yeah, Well, if you think about it, I mean, that's right. That's one of Satan's most effective tools is to make us think about ourselves, which immediately takes our eyes off of God and takes our eyes off of people in the sense of compassionate, right? Because that would be how we would view them through God's eyes, but instead puts it to eyes on us, and then we look at people. When our eyes are on us, we look at people for how they can best serve us, not how we can best serve them, and that only leads to destruction. So and for me throughout this whole thing, and we're not going to get into it too much, but I just felt such a clear picture of this is our culture right now. Is the aggressiveness and the anger and the destruction of our words. And when I read through Twitter, I have some pastors that I follow. I have like DBU baseball that I follow, and then I've got political things that will pop up. And I made the mistake one time of clicking on something, so now my algorithm feeds it to me, right? And it's on both sides, and it just is so hateful. And I'm not going to list people because that gets people angry and that gets people fired up. But it's on both sides, and it's just like there's nothing. And it's from people sometimes that are professing to be godly people. And it's just so infuriating to go, why are we speaking with such hate? It doesn't mean I agree with everything that's going on in the culture. It doesn't mean that I don't have personal convictions and biblical stances on things. But it sure as heck doesn't mean that I'm going to vilify this person or this group because they're different than me. That is what James, to me, is speaking about. And all I see in our culture is fires that I don't know how they're going to go out, because I don't see people. I'm now seeing Christians, and this, I think I started seeing it a lot during COVID, picking sides and becoming angry. And it's heartbreaking. And as a pastor, it's exhausting. Because it just, man, it's hard. It's hard. So that was something I think that stood out to me in this whole chapter, was just how broken our culture is right now. But that we can only take responsibility for us, and that Jesus also was he was in a place that they hated him, the religious leaders, and they wanted to kill him. It's obviously there's not many people in Wiley, I think, that want to kill me, which is good. I hope not. But that's, that he still gave us the best example of love, even to the religious leaders. He called them out on a lot of crap, but he also was patient and at times and loved them. And if their hearts were right, man, he accepted them in a heartbeat. So cool. Okay. Anything else?
I think for the wisdom portion, I came back to James 1:5, where it says, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him." I think I'm recognizing that I take that verse out of context. I feel like in my head, I make it feel too easy to just ask God for wisdom, and he'll give it to you. And there's not much you have to do to gain that wisdom. Just ask him. But not. I don't think that's really the point of that verse. I think it's more if you're when he says let him ask God, I think he's meaning like actually dig in, spend time asking God, not just in a one-liner in a prayer. Hey God, give me wisdom.
Right.
Yeah, it's not like
Right.
I've got this situation. I need help, God. I need your wisdom.
Yeah.
I think in tandem with that, we have to actually go into the scripture and also do our part in the action portion of it to gain that wisdom. I don't think it's just going to be okay, here you go. And then it'll click. Oh, that's what I need to do. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Well, I think, isn't that also addressed in I want to say it's chapter 4 about the right way to pray? Or it's one of these chapters.
We're not there yet. Don't spoil it.
Sorry, no spoilers.
No, and I think you're right, man. I think it's that God is not quick, and God is, like Ryan said earlier, God is very slow, and which is why wisdom is slow, because God is the author of wisdom. And that, you know, if you think back to Moses on Mount Sinai, it wasn't in all these other things that he heard God. He had to wait for all of those things to pass. And I think sometimes we even think of those things as, oh, well, the fire was quick, and then it was this, and then it was this. No, man, there was probably, there could have been days. Moses was up there for months on Mount Sinai. Like, it was not a quick thing. And sometimes I think God is going, yeah, I'm going to see how faithful you are to this before I give you the answer. And that he wants us, like you said, Brandon, to continually pray for wisdom. Whether it's a specific thing or in a kind of a general sense, he wants us to continually pray about it. I mean, that's my example with this house. I prayed for 2 months. I didn't know what the heck to do, and truly had no clue which way it was going to end on, and just kept praying every day. Lord, I need guidance. I need wisdom. And he just walked me through slowly through the whole thing. He never gave me an answer until the very end, but he just walked me through slowly the whole thing. So that's really good. Cool. All right. Well, hey, appreciate it, gentlemen. Back next Thursday with chapters 4 and 5. It's a bit more text to cover, so we'll teach it on Thursday nights, and then we'll hop on and talk about it. But all right, I appreciate it. I will yeah, see you. All right. Hey, Judah, I hope you enjoyed that, man. We just did a really good conversation on James chapter 3. I'm gonna post this again. Actually, wait, give me a second.